So I just wanted to see about running with a few of these clips that I did want to share with y'all. And we'll start out with the Kyle Bass clip on CNBC because I heard this one and I just loved it. This is on CNBC with Brian Sullivan, and listen to the host basically beg him not to call it the Chinese virus.
Let's just call it COVID-19, not Wuhan or China or coronavirus. Let's call it the COVID-19. Kyle, I think that'll bring us all together. Can we do that? Come up with a common name?
You know what, Brian, I'll agree with you on a lot of things, but, changing the naming convention for viruses that's gone on for the last 100 years, the point of origin has always helped people understand which virus it is. And the Chinese Communist Party has asked the world, or actually really propagandized the world with this COVID-19. If we start naming diseases after numbers, we're never going to remember what kind of disease it is.
I understand. I want to make sure we don't make it we don't take it to a country level. You know what I mean? Because this is a global fight. You would agree with that, right?
We call things West Nile virus. Why don't we call it the Wuhan flu? We can call it whatever we want to call it. I'm not going to call it what the Chinese government wants me to call it.
He's not going to call it what the Chinese government wants him to call it.
Joining us here exclusively on CBC, Kyle.
And neither should you as well. You should call it whatever you want to call it. And if that's the Wuhan flu or the Chinese virus, and if the president wants to call it that, I support him 100%. Like Kyle Bass said, and he's the manager of a big, hedge fund type of an entity. Like he said, though, this is the way we've been naming viruses for 100 years, and probably more than that, frankly. So this is a time-tested way that we name viruses from their point of origin, which helps us to distinguish which one we're talking about. I mean, we talked about last week, even with the swine flu, was named after swine because that's where the virus came from. Now, Dr. Anthony Fauci, who's kind of front and center in this whole situation, he was involved back with the swine flu epidemic as well. Now, speaking in much more measured tones and much less reactionary than he is today. Today, he says we've got to shut down the entire economy. And I want to tell you a little something about Dr. Anthony Fauci when we get done with this clip. But listen to him here in 2009 talking about the swine flu.
How can a person tell if they have the regular seasonal flu or if they've contracted the 2009 H1N1 influenza virus?
Well, for a person, him or herself, to be able to determine that would essentially be impossible because you can get everything from very, very mild illness to severe illness with either seasonal flu or the H1N1 new 2009 pandemic flu. Most of the time, it's a mild disease, but there are unusual cases that can be severe. The only way a person can tell is if they get their blood drawn or other laboratory tests, which could specifically distinguish between one and the other. But that is something that is not done routinely. So if someone wakes up in the morning and feels that they're not well, they get a fever, a muscle ache, some cough, the things that you would get with the flu, it would be very difficult for them to determine whether it's seasonal flu or the H1N1.
So, I mean, it's basically, it parallels, if you're listening to it, it parallels what we're dealing with now. You can have everything from mild symptoms. First of all, it's very similar to the seasonal flu. And that's what we're seeing. I mean, none of these things that people are reporting have happened to them are that much different than how you feel with the seasonal flu. Body aches, difficulty breathing, fever, cough, things like that. Yeah, that's the same with the seasonal flu and this Wuhan coronavirus as well. So the parallels are simply there between what's happening today and what happened with the swine flu a little more than 10 years ago. And the question is, why are we responding so much differently at this time? Why are we making this such a, this is the end of the world type of story? And that's exactly what the media has been doing. I mean, just nonstop. You've got to stay home. We've got to close down the cities. And you know what? Maybe they're right. I don't know. We don't know enough about this virus, but they certainly haven't shared with us anything that would lead me to believe it's that much different than the swine flu virus was back in 2009.
Is it just because it is more contagious and it has a different sort of inoculation period, incubation period where you don't know if you have it for 14 days?
It's a good question. I mean, a lot of people apparently, I've seen the stories, 86% don't ever know they have it. I mean, what are we dealing with here? You can always slice the pie pretty thinly and look at one factor and say, well, you might not know if you have it for a long period of time or not. And based on that alone, we're going to make all these assumptions. I'd like to hear the logic spelled out. That's what I'd like to hear. I mean, did they really make these decisions because they think there's going to be up to 2 million U.S. deaths from this? And that's that Royal College study that came out of England that they apparently were looking at. It's hard to know. I mean, nobody has really explained to us why we're taking such draconian measures and shutting down our entire economy, which is going to be a lot harder to bring back. I mean, because it's a domino effect, It's a domino of this baseline economic activity that people engage in from day to day is what supports a lot of the other things that we're doing. And already you see, people are pulling money out of investments. Well, that's not just Wall Street investments, which you've seen a dramatic decline in the money in the financial markets, but you're also looking at people not putting investments into small businesses. And that's really the key driver and has historically always been the key driver of our economy, Main Street. I mean, if you're a small business owner right now, you may well be shut down. I think we've got something like 9 different states with different versions of stay-at-home orders in place. And a lot of small businesses are small retail, restaurants, bars, things like that. That's a lot of our small businesses. And they don't have 2 or 3 months of cash, just like we talked about in China, those small businesses. They don't have 2 or 3 months of cash to just ride this out. And they don't have the money to pay their employees.
I'll tell you who has a lot of cash, though. The ATMs. They said don't take your money out of the ATMs because there's tons of money the Federal Reserve is going to pump into the banks, and your money is safe.
Well, you were watching 60 Minutes last night with Neil Kashkari, right? He's the president of the Minnesota Federal Reserve. And he says, and it's nice to hear somebody finally being somewhat honest with us about this, but he says that the Federal Reserve has an infinite capacity to print dollars. Infinite. Not there are absolutely no limits whatsoever. Well, and that may well be true, but just remember, in the Weimar Republic in Germany, they also had an infinite capacity to print their fiat currency. And what can happen when you really put that pedal to the metal, which is what we've been doing solid now for a long time. I mean, we're talking over 10 years. We've steady had the QE situation going in our country where we're doing quantitative easing. We're having the Federal Reserve. I mean, the federal government's now talking about taking equity positions in U.S. businesses to try to, quote unquote, prop up the economy. I mean, how is it that in America we could be talking about the government beginning to own businesses? I mean, that is what you talk about in communist countries and socialist countries, right, is central ownership. That's what China, that's the situation in China. China owns all their big companies. Their government owns it. Now, they may have different structures that they can try to engage in some sort of plausible deniability about whether or not they actually own it. But China, the country, the government itself, the Communist Party, which is the government of the state of China, owns its major industries, its big businesses outright. They own them. And that's what we're talking about doing here. So I guess we've got to kill our country to save our country. We've got to destroy our country to save it. I mean, that's basically what they're telling us. But think about, we had a scare where some of us thought, that we could get into a hyperinflationary type of a scenario, which is where you see the relative value of your dollars drop precipitously. And so this $1,000 that they're sending you to spend, what do you think happens when they do that? I mean, you give everybody $1,000 more dollars, the prices are going to go up, right? That's inflation. What it means is it's not so much that the prices go up, because prices are what they call nominal or just named prices. What we're really talking about is the value of the dollar goes down. Thank you for listening to the Morgan Streetman Show. We hope you enjoyed what you heard, and if you did, please click like and subscribe to help us out. And remember that we recommend that you exercise your brain at least once a week.